All right, let's get started. The International Parking and Mobility Institute is pleased to present this webinar titled Mayor's Commuter Incentives Toolkit, Parking Cashout and Other Commuter Benefits Ordinance Analysis. My name is Kenny and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you need assistance at any time during the program, please raise your hand or use the chat feature and we will assist you. Today's presentation will last 60 minutes and include a specific question and answer period. However, you can queue up a question for us at any time during today's presentation. To enter a question to the webinar system, simply click the Q&A tab or the chat and type the question and press enter. All registered participants will receive an archived version of this presentation in a few days. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Alan Greenberg and Gabby Albazed from the Federal Highway Administration. Alan, Gabby, it's all yours.
Kenny, thank you so much, and thank you to IPMI. We're absolutely delighted to be here. I'll introduce Gabby and myself just in a moment, but I just really want to say how thrilling it's been to have the partnership we've had over the years with IPMI, really the folks who think about, process, and then ultimately implement the smartest, best policies regarding parking and dealing with both its benefits and externalities. It's been my pleasure over the years to work with the professionals who are members of IPMI, and of course the team, Sean, Kenny, and the rest of the team at the staff level have been always very wonderful to work with. I'm delighted to make this presentation along with Gabby Abu-Zaid, who's really the analysis brains behind all of this. The subject is the impacts of city-level parking cash-out and commuter benefits ordinances. And I will start by sort of giving you the background of how we made choices as to what to analyze and why the strategy is so important. And then Gabby is going to be giving the presentation about sort of really getting into specifically how we did the analysis. And depending upon timing, we'll either go to some questions or get into some, even deeper into some additional kind of neat findings. Either way, this is sure to be, I think, a really nice discussion. Gabby is, I'm going to introduce Gabby first. And Gabby is with ICF Incorporated. She's a transportation data specialist, and her work entails supporting state, local, and federal clients in transportation demand management, transportation system management and operations, public transportation investments, transportation and land use intersections, especially as related to parking and sustainable mobility. Gabby holds a Master's of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering with a transportation emphasis from Portland State University and a bachelor's degree in Sustainable Built Environment from the University of Arizona. And I will just as a personal note say that I've worked with a lot of people who have done analysis for us and with us over the years. And Gabby is fantastic, and I don't just say that, and you'll see it when she makes the presentation. As for my own background, been around doing this sort of work for almost 30 years, and interested in many of the same things. Gabby's interested in transportation efficiency, incentives, interested in equity and sustainability. And that has often led me to work in the parking space, not exclusively, but often. And we've looked at the impacts of, for instance, parking cruising, and IPMI has been kind to really provide us a forum to present what we've found there, both in its fantastic monthly magazine and also through a webinar. And generally incentives and so on and so forth. So I think Gabby and I are a little bit curious to learn a little bit about who's in the audience. So Kenny, I think you had some questions you were going to ask for your kind of, if you can cue that up, and that will help us too in gearing our presentation. Thank you.
Here's a few IPMI audience questions, everybody. Take about 30 seconds to answer those. There's 3 questions, so you might have to open the poll window to see the rest of them.
Okay, so that's standard disclaimer. So bottom line, folks, is that we're here to provide tools and information, and we're not really telling anyone what to do, but we know that IPMI members in particular want to be really educated and know what can be known about impacts before they make decisions, and so that's what we're here to offer. Okay, so we saw that some people had some familiarity and some had very little. So basically, what is parking cashout? And some had quite a lot, and we welcome all of you, and we appreciate everybody's participation. Put simply, if an employer is subsidizing parking, parking cashout means that they're giving their employee the option to take the benefit of equivalent value through and forfeit the parking, not take the parking that they're offered. So the first place they would go is to take the benefit tax-free through an employer-paid public transit or van pool benefit. It's tax-free because the federal tax code makes it tax-free, but some folks will commute by other modes, such as carpooling or walking, and they would get a fully taxable increase in their cash compensation. For those taking public transit or van pool, and if the cost of that is less than the market value of the parking, then they would also get a cash payment, but it would be for the difference between the value of the parking and the cost of providing the transit or van pool benefit. There were studies. We're citing Donald Shoup. He's Dr. Donald Shoup is the kind of probably most esteemed person in the space. He's a UCLA professor who's written, among other things, A High Cost of Free Parking, a 800 or so page treatise on everything and anything related to impacts of parking. This particular source, we say, is from 97. I think actually the research may have been conducted a little bit earlier, but he looked, it's really, it's still germane and relevant today. He was looking at these sites basically across the street from each other, where some employers were either just charging for parking or not, or some were giving their employees something equivalent to a cash out offer. And we see huge differences depending upon what the very specific travel reduction metric you're looking at, but in the 11 to 13% reductions in driving, just based on that alone. The employers were otherwise pretty identical. They were all tech sector employers. They were geographically pretty much co-located. They were across the street from each other. And interestingly, Dr. Shoup found that an awful lot of them, at the time, LA didn't have as good transit options and so forth as it does today, but quite a lot of them, most of them, I think it was on an order of 3 or 4 times higher than other modes, were just carpooling. Now, this was in the day when people had sort of the same work start time and end time, so maybe people would make slightly different ways of changing what they do, but that's a pretty good indicator that this is a big deal, especially when you look at traffic operation studies. If you can pull that number of vehicles off the freeways at times that things are most congested, you have an enormous reduction in congestion. Okay, so this is part of a larger suite of strategies we're interested in looking at federal highways, where we're taking fixed costs, fixed, hidden, and bundled travel costs, and including parking costs, and making them transparent and variable. And that's sort of the broader strategy that we're looking at. The literature converges, and there's quite a lot of literature on the subject, on a price elasticity of negative 0.3 for the change in vehicle travel in relation to the price. What that means is if you double the price of travel, you would get a 30% reduction in travel. So in driving alone. So that's what that means. And that's a key parameter for how that's used a lot in the analysis, and Gabby will talk about that in the analysis. Of course, getting people to drive less in and of itself is not important. What's important is what the benefits, externalities are. And one thing to note about parking cash out and a lot of these commuter benefits in particular is that we're actually providing an opportunity cost for people to get something that they didn't have before. So these are voluntary changes that people are making. And they wouldn't make those changes unless it was personally beneficial to them. And why do we want to do it? Well, it's for all those sort of public policy goals that we see, what we're all familiar with. Certainly congestion relief is top of mind. But reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, we have Vision Zero goals about reducing injuries and fatalities. And we're also concerned about equity. People who are traveling by, say, bus and tend to be lower income, and are they stuck in traffic? Do they have a reasonable commute? And can we help make that commute more reasonable by getting people into modes that are less traffic inducing? Next slide. Okay, so this one's a complicated slide, and I'm going to tell you that if you're interested in some of these topics, we can help you learn more. But this is just sort of a summary of things to think about when you're trying to make sense of, is this new, or is this how out there is this stuff, or is this a couple of analysts at Federal Highways that just want to do some analysis? Well, the most directly applicable to what we're going to be discussing today is in the leftmost column, and that is the laws that currently exist. Washington, D.C. has an ordinance that they just really started, it passed it just when COVID was getting started, but it required implementing regulations to actually get going, and they finished those a bit less than a year ago, and then it's been published a lot this year, and they were enforced beginning this year. And so that was after California had a law that they passed in '92. So we haven't seen a whole lot of action. Rhode Island did something similar to California in later years, but there's been a lot of really recent activity. So DC's ordinance basically says if an employer provides parking to employees, they have to offer their employees the market value of that parking as a cash out. It applies to employers with 20 or more employees. And there are some alternative compliance paths as well that DC has that could work in some jurisdictions, probably wouldn't in others. There is TDM, Transportation Demand Management Planning, that some employers do, and it involves, so it's an alternative where if you have a modal goal, as DC does, to not have more than 25% of employees driving to work alone, then they have a planning process that if an employer follows it aggressively, they can actually, and they meet those goals, and they would be exempt from having a cash out, although they would have to be doing something fairly aggressive in this space in order to meet a goal like that, because that's a challenging goal. California's law was passed in 1992. There were a whole range of reasons it wasn't enforced much. I won't get into those now. One key one, though, that we found was that it was based, the cash out requirement was based on an employer being able to save out-of-pocket costs. And even very recently, when Santa Monica, the jurisdiction within California that's done the most to try to enforce the state law, has tried to get employers to offer cash out. 3/4 of the employers that were otherwise supposed to be subject to the law claimed that they incurred no out-of-pocket costs to provide parking because it was either bundled in a lease or somehow hidden in a way that they couldn't, quote unquote, save the money if they got an employee to cash it out. So Rhode Island's law is sort of California light. It says that if an employer offers free parking within a well-serviced transit corridor, then they have to offer their employees employer-paid transit benefits. So that's, of course, only if they use the transit and can use the transit. Significantly in California, the governor just signed on September 30th some changes to that law, and they're quite meaningful actually. For one, the changes would make it so that cash out value is based on market value, and there's a very set procedure to calculating that market value. The law, it's AB 2206. Again, AB 2206 is if you're looking for the law. It also does a number of other things. It has notification requirements, so employers have to inform their employees about the benefit. They also have to document that they've followed the law in the discovery process for determining market value of parking. These are all things that they're all in the weeds, but they're kind of what got things caught up last time. So that just was signed, and California's law applies. It's to employers with 50 or more employees in a non-attainment area for at least one air pollutant, which is probably most places in California. And only employee leased parking. DC's law, 20 employees, leased parking, or sold or owned parking if it's been sold subsequent to the law passing. So there's a few details. They both have a floor value as well. So DC, if you can't calculate it based on the procedures in the law, you would have a floor value of $175 a month. California, if you similarly, but that would be $50 a month, or the lowest price transit accessing the site, whichever is actually higher. Anyway, there's a lot of details in there, and certainly we can get you and IPMI additional information on all of this if that's a bunch to share. Second column, pre-tax benefits. That one's sort of easier. It has nothing to do actually with an employer providing parking. It's just that an employer makes an accommodation within their payroll system to allow an employee to use their own money, their own wage, pre-tax, to pay for their own transit. And so it's allowable by federal law, and if the accommodation is made, then the employee saves the tax amount. And the employer saves some money too, because it's tax-free. So for instance, on the payroll tax, there's an employer side and an employee side. The employer would save on the employer side just as the employee would save on both the income side and the employee side. Third column is just a note that if you're a university or an individual employer and you want to do the right thing, and your city doesn't have an ordinance and your state doesn't require it, you still can. And some are, and they're having some real benefits. And these are 3 examples of doing either something like a cash out directly or something akin or very similar to it. I want to note that when I list the city of Austin here, I'm referring to the program and policies they have in place for their own employees, and that is not a citywide ordinance. And then a number of jurisdictions, the rightmost column, are offer tax credits for various commuter benefits kinds of programs, including parking cash out. That's on the far right. Next slide. Okay, so what is it we're trying to do? Well, we want to analyze and evaluate. We're here to sort of help you understand what the impacts of these kinds of things would be if cities chose to adopt any of a range of policies related to cash out and or commuter benefits. So our primary metric again is changes in vehicle miles traveled. What we do is in order to sort of provide you this tool, we chose a sample of 9 cities. Tends to be the larger cities where we thought the impacts would be fairly large, but it relates also to where we had the data that would support the analysis and so forth. And then we look at 5 core scenarios. And ultimately, anytime someone implements something, it'll be some hybrid of things that we're looking at, but we wanted to give you sort of an order of magnitude sense of what different scenarios would do in different types of cities. Here's the showing of the cities we looked at, and so we there it is. We can go to the next slide. Good. All right. So this is again high level here. So the first thing when you're looking at both from a political standpoint about who's going to be impacted from an employer standpoint, and also from an analysis standpoint is who does a particular policy measure impact? Which employers? Who is going to be which employers and then employees of those employers are impacted? So the first is the classic monthly parking cash out. I have slides subsequently that give a little bit more on each of these. But that's just strictly impacting employers that are providing free parking. That's what I'd say is the DC ordinance, the California law, and would be sort of the classic. Well, actually, I'll get to that in a minute. The second one is the commuter benefits, and that's a simplified term for if you offer employees free parking, you have to offer them the transit benefits. That's the Rhode Island law. Actually, scenario 3 is closest to DC, and scenario 1 is closest to California, because DC does have a pre-tax law. So for the employers that don't that aren't offering parking, they are required to offer within their payroll systems and accommodation to employees to spend their own money. So that part of the law impacts them, and then there's a cash out part of the law, which is the same as what you see in California, slightly different rules as to who it applies to, but that's if the employer is providing the parking benefit. Then we looked at 2 sort of more aggressive scenarios, and I'll talk about them in a moment. But here, 2 for all the scenarios, the 3 bottom ones, it would impact both employers giving free parking and not. The 5th one being a little bit different still, because it's actually a requirement to eliminate subsidized parking. So that affects all employers, and then to provide a universal payment. So it affects employers regardless of if they're offering parking now or not. All right, let me roll the next 2 slides. They show a little bit more, a summary of a little bit about what each of them, each of the policies are. As I noted, the first one's a monthly cash out, quite simple. If you're giving someone a monthly parking benefit, they would get an option to cash out of that for the month. The second one, as I know, is the Rhode Island law, which is that the employer only has to give the employee the benefits that the federal government recognizes as tax-free, which are transit subsidies and van pool subsidies. And those, again, those 2 apply to only the employers that are doing parking, or offering free parking. If you're not offering free parking, and one of those, an ordinance follows one of those 2 things, then you wouldn't have to concern yourself with either of those. And then the next 3, as I noted, have the something impacting the employers offering parking, but also those who are not offering parking. So it's the pre-tax transit. And by the way, in DC's case, they actually did pre-tax transit before they did cash out. And some other jurisdictions require pre-tax transit, and they don't have a cash out requirement. New Jersey, for example, has a statewide pre-tax law, which they passed a couple of years ago. They don't require cash out. California now has a cash out law, but they don't require pre-tax. So again, things happen. I mean, everyone's looking at what everyone else is doing, so I would expect more activity in this space there. Okay, scenario 4 is kind of interesting, and Gabby's going to cover this in the analysis, but I think it's particularly germane as we come out of COVID and this hybrid work environment, which is that we have some studies that Gabby will mention where we do know that if you offer a cash out benefit on a daily basis, people actually are going to be more responsive than if it's monthly. Why? Because people may be reluctant to give up a space for an entire month, but on a day-to-day basis, they might have some days that they're just a bit more flexible. Maybe they don't have to be dressed quite as nicely in one day so they could bicycle to work, or they're not carrying quite as much on a particular day, or they have a little bit more time in their schedule on some days than others. And so if you don't lock them in and you give them an incentive every day to not drive alone and park, they're going to take that more than if they have to lock themselves in for a month. And then the last slide. On the last side's kind of a cool one. This is we noticed there's a woman who we had an advisory group, which is usually helpful. IPMI was on it, and we had some really esteemed researchers, Dr. Shoup certainly. There's a woman, Andrea Hammer, who has done really wonderful work looking at commuter benefits ordinances and their impacts and travel surveys, regional travel surveys, and so forth. And she focused mostly in the Northeast. She got a whole bunch of data sets, but what we found in her analysis was, geez, if an employer just offered transit benefits and didn't offer any parking subsidies, we saw by far the greatest number of employees getting to work by ways other than driving alone and parking. And so this scenario was sort of inspired by that. And we actually, when we wrestled with it, we actually thought originally that maybe it's way out there. And then as we sort of thought more about it, we actually think it's kind of pretty feasible. These are the ways that there's a question about documenting what employees do. And I think that actually it's doable. But let's be clear, this is designed to be the most aggressive scenario that there is. It says, hey, in our jurisdiction, you can't subsidize parking at all, even if it's federally tax favorable. Here's what you have to do instead. It would have huge benefits, but it's also the most sort of aggressive and perhaps intrusive, if you want to call it that. But we wanted to put out a whole range of scenarios and see what the numbers tell you, and then you all can make your own decisions as to what may work or not in your own jurisdiction. And I think the next slide, I think you're up next, Gabby, if I'm recalling correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Thanks so much, Alan.
All right, sure.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I think it's helpful to lead with that context. I'm next going to give a really high overview, 10,000-foot view of our data and methodological approach before really getting into our results, where things get particularly interesting. We sourced several key inputs for our analysis related to employee populations, both citywide populations and populations who have subsidized parking and transit benefits, employee commute characteristics like mode splits, travel cost factors, namely market monthly parking prices and transit pass costs, and then something to measure driver responsiveness. So we searched the literature to identify elasticity of VMT with respect to parking or travel costs, and the elasticity of transit ridership with respect to transit costs. And those inputs were sourced through a variety of data sources, including the American Community Survey, National Household Travel Surveys, local travel surveys, literature reviews, on and on and on. Our main data outputs included reduction in vehicle travel. We primarily look at the reduction in average daily commute VMT. We also look at reductions in driving-related externalities like congestion, emissions, and crashes, which are all top of mind. And equity is also top of mind. So we explore impacts on equity through a complementary analysis of American Community Survey data and some local and regional household travel surveys. We make several necessary adjustments as part of our analysis, the first being for California cities. We are looking at Los Angeles and San Diego. For employees in those cities who are already have cash out, we don't double count them in any of our scenarios where cash out is being offered. Similarly, employees who have transit benefits already are not double counted in those scenarios where new transit benefits are offered. We also make an adjustment for employees who are already receiving transit benefits and who would then be eligible for cash out in case their behavior is slightly different from the employee population who wasn't receiving either of those things. We adjust benefit values based on taxation rules using a marginal tax rate that looks at state and federal taxes. And finally, the baseline commute VMT upon which we are applying reductions have been scaled to reflect telework expectations in the near term. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about this. We investigated several sources on expectations for telework after the COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, we looked to some work by Mokhtarian, Wang, and Kim, who, through a series of surveys, estimated post-pandemic telework occasions to be between 1.4 to 3.2 times what they were before the pandemic, with the most likely scenario being around 2 times those pre-pandemic rates. So based on those estimates, we scaled down the baseline number of commuters that we were looking at to account for those increased telework rates. So teleworkers then are essentially excluded from our analysis. We're only focused on commute VMT, which is not to say that telework doesn't have its own slew of implications for both commute VMT and non-commute VMT. We also made several assumptions in our analysis. Some key ones are that we assume full adoption and compliance by all affected employers. We primarily consider employees with free parking as being eligible for cash out due to data limitations. We did conduct a sample analysis to try to gauge the impact of partial subsidies on our results. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about that today because it's pretty interesting. We assume no transit capacity restrictions that would restrict mode shift to those modes. And then based on discussion with the peer review group convened for this study, crashes are assumed to scale linearly with VMT when examining safety impacts of our modeled scenarios. Moving into our analysis approach with scenario 1, looking at monthly parking cash out. Scenario 1 really served as the baseline for much of our analysis, while scenarios 2 through 5 built on the results or methodologies or both from scenario 1. So throughout our analysis, for the purposes of examining travel behavior, we look at the option to receive cash in lieu of a parking space as an increase in the cost of driving. So in other words, the cash that you forego by not taking cash out is the opportunity cost of continuing to drive and park at work. And so that value is used as our starting point for scenario 1, and we determine that using market city-specific rates of parking and that marginal tax rate that looks at both state and federal taxes. From there, we estimate the VMT reduction by averaging results from 2 different methods, one using the University of South Florida's TRIMS model, and another using the arc elasticity of -0.3 to look at the VMT reduction. Travel impacts for scenario 2 are estimated using the same approach as I just described for scenario 1, but instead of the cash out value being based on the market monthly parking price, we use the average transit cost for each city instead. Now, one output of that approach when we are using the TRIMS method is that in that model, we saw shifts to the newly subsidized modes. So under this policy, that would be transit and van pool. But we also saw some shifts to carpooling, bicycling, and walking. Now, some of that shift to those non-incentivized modes was reapportioned back to transit and van pool. Since those are being incentivized, we'd expect to see the biggest kind of jumps in those modes. But some less prominent shifts to the other modes, carpooling, bicycling, and walking, were accepted just under the assumption that some single occupancy vehicle drivers would be willing to entertain alternative modes of travel. Now, scenario 3 offers monthly parking cash out to employees who have free workplace parking. Scenario 4 offers a daily cash out option. And then both scenarios extend pre-tax transit benefits to the employee population who is not receiving free parking at work or offered free parking at work. Those pre-tax transit benefits offered to employees under both of those scenarios reduce the transit trip costs through tax savings that employees are experiencing, which is the average price of the transit pass multiplied by that marginal tax rate. We use an elasticity of transit ridership with respect to transit price of -0.15 to calculate an increase in transit riders. And then increases in transit trips were applied to baseline transit mode shares for this employee population, and all other modes use was assumed to decline proportionally based on their original shares. So what you get with scenario 3 is essentially the results of scenario 1, plus the results of offering that pre-tax transit benefit policy to the employee population without free parking. For scenario 4, we have to make a slight adjustment to scenario 1 because daily cash out is assumed to result in an additional 16% shift away from solo driving beyond what monthly cash out would offer based on the results of a Minneapolis study, which is the best study that we could find to kind of inform that. And ultimately, we think the daily cash out, especially looking forward, is going to be more attractive to employees and offer more flexibility. Scenario 5 is the requirement to eliminate subsidized parking entirely and provide a universal $5 per day employer-paid non-SOV commute benefit. To calculate VMT here, we recreated the approaches described in scenarios 1, 2, and 4 with different inputs, so primarily starting mode shares and travel costs based on the different employee populations being examined. So we split the analysis by 3 employee population groups and then added the results together. Those groups were employees who were offered free parking, which would now be eliminated under this scenario. Employees in Los Angeles and San Diego who had already been offered cash out and who would now be offered this benefit, and employees who weren't offered free parking to start with and then would be offered this benefit. Here with that $5 subsidy, if you are going to commute by transit or van pool, you're going to get that full $5 tax-free. If you're commuting by another non-SOV mode, you would pay taxes on that $5 subsidy. And because this scenario assumes it's a daily benefit, that additional 16% mode shift away from solo driving was applied here as it was in scenario 4. Data to scale VMT to reductions in delay, emissions, and crashes were taken from TRIMS' 4.0 version documentation. And again, discussion surrounding equity was built referencing American Community Survey data and regional household travel surveys. And there is a lot more information about all of our methods and data if you really want to dig in our upcoming report on this work, which we'll touch on in a bit. But moving into our results. First, looking at the raw or absolute reductions in daily citywide commute VMT by scenario and by city. So with respect to absolute VMT reduction, bigger cities with higher employee populations boast higher absolute VMT reduction potential across cities. Makes sense, you have a bigger employee population, there's more VMT that you can aim to reduce. Scenario 5 achieves the greatest reduction results across the board, followed by scenarios 4, that's daily cash out plus pre-tax transit benefits. Scenario 3, monthly cash out plus pre-tax transit benefits. Scenario 1, monthly cash out. And finally, scenario 2 achieved the lowest absolute reduction results. That's that monthly commuter benefit. And we'll discuss some of the trends that we're seeing here in the following several slides. This next slide shows the results displayed as the daily percentage reduction in commute VMT by city and scenario. Those figures range from 1% to up to 36%, depending on the city and depending on the scenario. And here that same data is presented in a slightly different way, just in graphical form. Trends-wise within each city, the order of scenario effectiveness follows that of the absolute reductions. Scenario 5 has the greatest impacts, followed by 4, 3, 1, and 2. And overall, those impacts are going to vary widely among scenarios and cities. So with the absolute reduction, you're going to see the biggest absolute reduction potential in cities that have the biggest employee populations to draw from. Here, in terms of the relative reductions, you'll see differences in terms of the employee population being impacted. So is it all employees or is it just employees who are receiving free parking? By the starting mode share, so how many people in a given city are currently driving to work alone? And also due to differences in pricing. So how much is the market cost of parking and how does that translate to the potential incentive that folks can receive if they go the cash out route? And happy to speak to some more of those differences in terms of if you're looking at your city and thinking more about this, what are some key characteristics to think about when thinking about these policies? So digging into kind of a summary of our results, our 2 monthly cash out scenarios, scenario 1 and scenario 3, show significant potential for reducing daily VMT. The reduction potential of scenario 3 is slightly higher than that in scenario 1. Recall that scenario 3 builds on scenario 1 by adding that additional requirement for employers who aren't offering free parking to add those pre-tax transit benefits. And while the effects of that you might think they could be small compared to an employer-paid transit benefit, it really depends on the employee population for a given city. So for example, in San Diego, over 80% of employees are receiving free parking at work and would be eligible for parking cash out. And so the jump between scenario 1, which is this first bar, and scenario 3 The third bar for San Diego is not very prominent because the majority of the employee population is experiencing a change between the two policies. They're getting monthly cash out in both of them. In the case of a place like New York, where only 4% of the employee population gets free parking at work, the difference between scenario 1 and scenario 3 is much more pronounced, because going from scenario 1 to scenario 3, in scenario 3, you're opening up a benefit to the vast majority of the employee population that would be excluded under scenario 1. So what the proportion of those employee populations look like in each city definitely will influence the effectiveness of a given scenario. Now, scenario 2, which is the employer paid monthly transit or van pool benefit, shows more modest reductions than the cash out scenarios, likely due to there just being fewer employers who are willing to take a transit only benefit as compared to a cash offer. Scenario 4 shows greater reduction potential than scenario 3. This is really by design. We assume that if employees are offered a daily cash out option, it's going to be more flexible than a monthly option, and more employees are going to take that and reduce their driving. You can see a sort of similar trend in the two cities we just talked about, San Diego and New York. So in San Diego, you can see there's a fairly prominent difference between scenarios 3 and 4 in terms of their effectiveness. That's because the majority of the employee population there is going to be affected by the cash out portion of that policy. And so when you're jumping to daily cash out, it's going to be more effective and is going to apply to the majority of the employee population there. In New York, the difference between those two scenarios is much less pronounced because the majority of the employee population, nothing changes for them between scenarios 3 and 4. They're still receiving those pre-tax transit benefits. Now, scenario 5, which is again that requirement that employers eliminate subsidized parking completely and provide a universal $5 daily non-SOV commute benefit, offers the greatest reduction potential in all cities, likely because it eliminates those parking subsidies entirely. It offers equal non-SOV commute benefits for all modes, regardless of what you previously received, and it offers those as a flexible daily benefit. Now, looking into some of our externalities analysis, we looked at the percent reduction in daily peak period delay by scenario and city. We calculated that using a method identified in the TRIMS model documentation that relies on both city-specific and baseline congestion measures. Now, the changes here in delay, we were previously looking at VMT, commute VMT, and reductions in commute VMT. When we're talking about delay, we looked at changes in delay relative to all peak time VMT, where we estimate roughly 55% of that is related to commuting. So the changes in vehicle hours of delay across scenarios generally follow the patterns that we've been seeing before, namely scenario 5 is the most effective. But to illustrate the impact of those reductions a bit more, we scaled them to annual measures to show the annual hours of delay reduced for scenarios 1 and scenarios 3, or scenario 5, excuse me, as an example. And you can see there's significant delay reduction potential to be had, particularly for the cities with the largest employee populations who might be experiencing the brunt of congestion impacts, I think New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago. We also estimated the impacts of the VMT commute reductions on carbon dioxide reductions, along with reductions in nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. Here we want to focus on the carbon dioxide reduction results, again, because these are derived from the VMT reductions. The patterns mimic those that we're seeing in terms of scenario 5 being the most effective. But those reductions aren't insignificant. And to put the estimates a bit into perspective, 500,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is close to the average annual reduction for cities in scenario 5, is equivalent to the consumption of more than 1 million barrels of oil, the energy use of more than 60,000 homes each year, and the carbon sequestered by roughly 8 million tree seedlings growing over 10 years. So these policies can really have a great impact in terms of thinking about CO2 reductions from the transportation sector. Finally, we looked at annual fatal and incapacitating injury crash reductions by city and scenario. Looking at the y-axis, while these estimates may seem relatively small in magnitude compared to some of our other results, I think it's really important to note that any reductions in fatalities or injuries on roadways are improvements to safety and are critically important. And I think that's really reflected in the growing prevalence of Vision Zero initiatives currently adopted in over 45 communities across the US. So regardless of the magnitude of these numbers, these are still important impacts to consider when looking at the effects of these policies. All right, now thinking a little bit about equity. The ordinances we look at have various implications for equity. And as a starting point, if free parking is traditionally only offered to specific employees, so if people are working in certain industries or at certain income levels, then free parking as a benefit from the start might disproportionately benefit certain groups of commuters over others. However, even if those benefits, the free parking benefits, aren't offered equitably from the start, Cashout is equity enhancing when offered to that population because it's providing an alternative benefit for employees who aren't able to take advantage of getting free parking. Maybe because they don't own a car or they have to share cars, so they aren't able to use it to commute to work, or they just live in a location where driving to work isn't the most convenient or attractive commute mode. Now, scenarios 3, 4, and 5 in our analysis offer a benefit to all employees, regardless of if they are receiving free parking at work or not, which that's the population impacted by scenarios 1 and 2. And so they're equity enhancing by expanding the employee population who is receiving a commuter benefit at all. One thing that's important to note with scenarios 3 and 4, that's the daily and monthly cash out and then the pre-tax transit benefits, is that those pre-tax transit benefits might be offered to employees, but it's possible employees might not be able to actually take advantage of them if they are unable or unwilling to commute via transit or van pool. So just because you offer it doesn't mean that the employee is going to receive a benefit from taking it. Looking at scenario 5, the proportion of employees able to realize a benefit is expected to be greatest there because it's offering that non-SOV commute benefit to everyone, regardless of if you had free workplace parking to start with or not, and what inequities might have existed in how that free workplace parking was offered. This is really important to consider from an equity perspective, thinking that in general, the lowest income households exhibit lower rates of vehicle ownership and higher rates of walking or biking commuting. And if those commuters who are walking and biking can't switch to another mode and they don't receive free parking at work, so they'd be ineligible for cash out, they're only going to realize a benefit out of scenario 5 and none of the other scenarios. And just to cap off that conversation on equity, we did look at some regional household travel surveys, and we found that the distribution of parking subsidies and transit commuter benefits varied by income level and industry in many cities. So looking at the New York City region as an example, some chi-square testing, statistical testing that we did revealed the lowest household income group experienced lower rates of being offered free parking across all sectors compared to all higher income groups. And so policies that are going to expand offerings of any benefit to commuters other than those who have free parking, in our analysis, that's scenarios 3 through 5, are going to have positive equity implications for employees there. Looking at the distribution of transit benefits, that lowest household income group has lower than average rates of being offered that in specific industries, including agriculture, utilities, finance, professional services, and management. And so policies which are going to expand offerings of that type of benefit in particular would have positive implications for equity in those sectors especially. Our report on this work is forthcoming. It offers different levels of detail. We have a really succinct executive summary. We have the main body of the report, which digs in more to our results. And then we have several appendices that really go into detail about our data and analysis and some questions that might come up as you're reading this work. So we will direct that resource to you all as soon as it is ready to go.
Thank you, Gabby. I've been involved in this work, and there's a lot there, and the presentation is succinct and clear, at least. But this is the first time some folks are hearing about this stuff, so there might be parts of it that flew by or you didn't get. So please, by all means, you'd be welcome to put questions in the chat pod. Gabby, what I want you to do is just show the next slide if you can. So we do have this is just so you know, we have looked into these when we got in, these are additional analysis questions really that just came up. They don't impact our core analysis and the results, but these are, if any of this is of particular interest to anyone and they want us to sort of go through any of these three, they're I think the three most interesting sort of parts of the appendix, so stuff that isn't sort of directly there. As you might imagine, when you look at affected commuters versus over a whole city, you're going to see much larger results. We were asked to look at partial versus full parking subsidies. It is occasionally the case that employers are giving employees a partial subsidies, and what would the impact be if we looked at that? And then the third one is quite germane to the debate that occurred within DC and also in California as to what happens when you start exempting groups of employers, typically by employee size. So if we have slides on any of that, if you're interested, but let's just generally get into questions. And I know my experience is you all are, and looking at the poll here, that you all are implementers, or a lot of you are implementers. You're either parking providers or you're at a university, which in many cases are parking providers, and also there's an academic interest there. So I want to open it up to anyone that may have a question. Kenny, if you want to take that for us.
Yep. If anybody has questions, please drop them in the chat now, or you can use the Q&A function. We have just enough time for a couple questions. So I will start here. How hard or burdensome is it on employers to offer parking cash out?
I mean, let me start if you want to. So I will say that I'm not aware of any case where an employer has started to offer cash out and reversed it. So to the degree that there's things to learn to offer it, certainly, and it might be to figure out how to who's taking it and who isn't, and you have to make some changes in what people are compensated as a result. But that's the normal thing. Employers give employees different levels of compensation depending upon, for instance, if they're using pre-tax dollars to pay for part of their health care. And I will say I know of some very small employers. There's an interesting story in DC where there were a couple of groups that merged, but there's was a very tiny group that was had like 2 employees, and the head of it but happened to want cash out as a matter of public policy. So the head of it said, look, I'm gonna just do this, I'm gonna figure this out. And she said, and she's not very administratively oriented, that was not her strength, and she said it really wasn't that difficult. So I think if you go to the daily cash out, then you have to manage the space a little bit more. So it depends on if the parking space is managed. You could base it on an attestation of people saying what days they did it or didn't, or if you have actually an automated system where you're knowing. So that, going from a monthly to a daily could involve more depending upon how the parking is set up.
Yeah, and I'll just add, quickly, there are also some benefits of doing it.
Sure.
In our report, we're not telling you how to go about implementing anything, but we do offer in a couple of our appendices, we point to some resources more focused on implementation, and also cover some of the benefits that exist in terms of offering these types of policies.
Right, and I'll add that the report is within FHWA's review process. So the slides are available, but I will say that IPMI will be, believe me, the first people I'm going to get on the phone with are Sean and Kenny, and we will, as soon as it's out there, we will make sure you all have access to it.
Great, thank you, Alan. Question from Dave Sorrell here. How difficult is it for self-funded parking departments or cities with tight impacted budgets to roll this out?
Similar to your first question, but it's a bit more specific, which is good. So I will say that certain types of policies are more or less challenging based on what the cities have in terms of their own professional capacity and structure. So if you had, so for instance, Washington, D.C. has an alternative client compliance mechanism that would work very well in, say, a Washington State or Seattle that's already doing TDM planning, where employers are specifically, and there's actually a statewide ordinance, so that they're set up as an organization to kind of deal with that. California doesn't have that, so that wouldn't be probably the best alternative compliance mechanism to do there. I will say that you can also start with what you have as your strong capability. So if you were in a jurisdiction, for example, that had a transit program where employers could buy into that program, that's not a bad place to start if that's an easy thing to administer. But I think the one thing I would back up for just a moment and say that let's not forget that providing employees parking is itself probably the most complicated thing you can do. You have to get the parking, you have to make sure it's used by your employees and not others, you have to communicate it if it's only available to some and not others, you have to sort of deal with that. So to the degree that there's some complexity involved, it's only because you're doing something differently than you did before. It's not necessarily in what you're doing. And as Gabby mentioned, there are some resources available that we cite in the report for places that sort of give guidance on that. And there are some employers that are also noted in a presentation and the report that have gone about to do that. So it's definitely a doable thing.
Okay, thank you, Alan. We have just one more time for this last question. I've encountered some issues with explaining this to HR within a city or department. Would this fall into a tax-related benefit person to organize, coordinate, or would this have to form a transportation department head to work with administration?
So a little of each, because there are tax implications of what you offer, and we take advantage of that, by the way. That's not a bad thing, to the degree that certain benefits can be offered tax-free. In fact, that's kind of why a lot of employers are offering parking to begin with, because it's treated tax favorably. We start by going to the modes that are tax favorably treated, the transit and van pool, and then we extend beyond it. So I think you need to sort of understand that that's why you make a payroll accommodation for the tax-free modes in the pre-tax transit, and also if the employer is required to pay for it because of the, say, under scenario 2. But I don't want to leave you with a sense that this is not quite doable. We have found that it is doable, but yes, it typically involves both people with tax knowledge to make sure they get that right. It's not very complicated, and also your transportation department to make sure you're actually managing the program correctly.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for those great questions, everybody. Any final thoughts, Alan or Gabby?
I think that we're delighted to work with you, where you can throw questions our way. I know that we throw an awful lot at you, and some of the good stuff is at the very end. So maybe you're looking at some of the results, and that's going to get you to continue to think. And there's a deadline on this webinar ending about 2 minutes ago. But Gabby, did you have any final comments or thoughts, or?
No, just thank you so much for joining and listening. If you have other questions, please reach out and we'll make sure to get that report out to you, which again has a ton of detail, but you can take just as much detail as you want or need depending on which section you're deciding to read.
And sometimes your questions are just brutally practical. You're like, you dealt with a high level, but how do I do this? And we're happy to take a hand at some of those too. So.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it, Kenny. It's been a delight to talk to your members, and so thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we must conclude today's program. A special thank you to Alan and Gabby for today's presentation. I also want to ask everyone if you could take a minute or two and provide feedback on this IPMI webinar by following the survey link in the chat. We appreciate your time and feedback. We look forward to having you join us for IPMI's November webinar, Parking Work is Emotional Customer Service Work, presented by Teresa Trussell, CAP, from Pay by Phone. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes today's presentation. You may now disconnect. Thank you, everybody.